Over the past week, the Trump administration has accelerated their attempts to target New York City's federal funding, despite a total lack of legal grounding for any of these assaults. So, in our weekly briefing, we wanted to review three separate threats: the new Sanctuary City executive order, their ongoing war on congestion pricing, and the threats that New York City's nonprofits are facing, and talk a little in this context especially of the state budget agreement that is being hammered out and the city's executive budget due later this week, about what the city and state can, and should be doing to stand up to and protect New Yorkers from those threats. So first is this new Sanctuary City executive order. The Trump administration has issued an executive order essentially listing sanctuary cities. This is apparently in response to a federal judge in California who blocked Trump's efforts to strip federal funding from over a dozen counties and cities across the country, and part of what that judge said was there's no legal grounding for any of this. Part of what that judge said is there's not even a clear list or definition of what a sanctuary city is. And so yesterday, Trump has issued an executive order, essentially seeking to make a list of or define sanctuary cities. But let's be clear, that does not provide any more legal grounding for the federal overreach that the administration is trying to do. There is no legal grounds for using the fact that cities work to keep our people safe, and let's remember that is what our sanctuary laws do. They simply prohibit city resources from being commandeered by the federal government and limit the circumstances where we cooperate. These policies go all the way back to Ed Koch, were maintained under Rudy Giuliani. Because we know that when people can report domestic violence, when they can report a crime they're a witness to, when they're not afraid to send their kids to school, New Yorkers are safer. If the Trump administration, for example, would want to put funding out and say cities that will collaborate with us on immigration enforcement, that would be hideous policy, but they would be legally welcome to do it, and we would not apply. They do not have legal grounds to threaten and take New York City's federal funding, and they'll lose in court here as well. Now, they were in court in San Francisco because San Francisco sued them. Here, unfortunately, the Adams administration has failed to go into court to protect New Yorkers. The only time they've done so was when this office forced them into court to get the $80 million back that Musk stole. There are many other places where the Trump administration is threatening our funding. We need to be in court. In part to defend our resources, and I'll go into a minute just what some of them are, and in part because if you don't stand up, then the bully winds up stealing your lunch money. On the other hand, when the Trump administration has been challenged in court, they keep losing. They lost in the prior round on sanctuary cities, and they'll lose on the next round on sanctuary cities as well. New York City needs to be in the fight. And I'll have more to say on that in just a moment. Okay, so what can the state and the city do? The state announced its budget deal, or the governor announced that there is a budget deal yesterday evening, and there are some critical elements in it that can provide New York City basic budget stability in the face of all the cuts that the Trump administration is making and is threatening. And I'll go through a few of them. We spoke last week about the 7,700 emergency housing vouchers that the Trump administration has made clear they intend to end. That's a national program that was launched during the COVID emergency that created new housing vouchers all across the country, and that they have now announced they are planning to end in the coming months. 7,700 New York City households rely on those emergency housing vouchers from the federal government. These were families that were homeless, basically, or facing homelessness, and if those vouchers are cut off, will be homeless unless new funding is identified. And of course, if they wind up homeless and go into shelter, the city will wind up spending on them anyway. So I was briefly encouraged when I heard that the Housing Access Voucher Program, which advocates have long been fighting for, is included in the budget agreement that was being discussed. But then I have to say, I was saddened to learn that that program, which was supposed to be was proposed as a $250 million program, is reportedly only a $50 million program in the budget agreement. $50 million is only enough for 2,600 vouchers statewide, and since the city generally gets, a third to half of a statewide program, that would be anywhere from 850 vouchers to maybe as many as 1,300, but that would barely put a dent in the 7,700 families that are going to be homeless due to these cuts from Trump. That would still leave nearly 7,000 or 6,500 families facing homelessness. And if we go that route, it wouldn't be one single voucher to help a family get out of shelter or get off the street into supportive housing. The idea of HAVP was to finally get the state involved. There are tens of thousands of federal vouchers and tens of thousands of city FEPS vouchers that the city is providing. Something is better than nothing, but putting just a paltry 700 or 800 or 1,000 vouchers on the table is not going to help New York City actually get out in front of our homelessness crisis, our housing crisis, or our Trump crisis. Unfortunately, one critical element I'm still looking at, and I think we need more details on, is ACS's big child care gap. While I commend the governor for expanding on eligibility and for the vision of moving in the direction of universal child care, up to 60,000 kids in low-income working families are going to lose their child care vouchers in New York City in the next fiscal year, absent a significant infusion of new state funding. And so we continue our call on the state to fill ACS's gap of $900 million through the next fiscal year. We anticipate that federal programs like Head Start will be on the chopping block as Congress does its right-wing budget. This is not a time to be leaving 60,000 kids facing the termination or the end of their funding. I know I want to continue to lift up Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez Rojas's fight to bring Article 6 funding to parity for New York City. We are facing massive public health cuts at the federal level under RFK Jr. Public health is under attack. This is a time for the governor to step forward and restore New York City's full Article 6 funding by passing A 2705. Under Andrew Cuomo, New York State reduced New York City's public health funding from 36% reimbursement, which is what every other county in the state has, to just 20%. Increasing the rate back to 36% would bring $90 million back to New York City. That is $90 million that we urgently need given the public health challenges we're facing, and for Albany to continue to shortchange New York City by $90 million on public health is a profound mistake. We should not allow Andrew Cuomo's assaults on New York City to stand. We should restore that money. And finally, with Trump particularly focusing on and weaponizing immigration, this is a critical time for both the state and the city to step up and make sure people get the legal services and case management that they need. No New Yorker should face deportation proceedings without an attorney. That was true before, but it's dramatically more true now with due process rights being denied, with kids as young as 2 years old who are citizens being deported without due process. Making sure families have legal representation is essential. And that's why New York State must make an investment of the $165 million advocates have been calling for immigration, legal services, and infrastructure statewide. From what we could tell, that does not appear to be in the handshake agreement, and I hope it will be included before it is too late. So that's state action and where some of the items in the state budget agreement relate to what's going on. Meanwhile, in New York City, later this week, Mayor Adams is expected to present his executive budget, and I've been calling for weeks now for that budget to grapple with the reality of the Trump administration, to revise its economic expectations based on the likelihood that tariffs lead to an economic downturn, or at least take that risk seriously, and to reckon with all of the cuts that the federal government is proposing. So, given the new executive order, I want to start here because step one, and this is new today, I am calling on Mayor Adams to recuse himself from defending the city's sanctuary status and to appoint someone in his administration or someone outside of his administration who could represent New York City, who is not tainted by his pardon from Donald Trump, by his chumminess with Tom Homan. We need someone representing New York City on our sanctuary city policies who's genuinely independent, who can stand up for the law, and who is not compromised by their coziness with the Trump administration. And sadly, that is not Eric Adams. So the mayor must recuse himself from decisions involving legal actions between the city and the Trump administration on sanctuary cities. We have procedures for resolving conflicts where individuals cannot represent the city in good conscience and with full independence, and it is straightforward right now that an independent public servant should be delegated that authority to ensure that the city's best interests are defended with integrity and not with personal or corrupt purposes. At the very least, he should recuse himself specifically when it involves the city's sanctuary laws. There is very compelling evidence that the mayor engaged in a quid pro quo, abandoning the city's laws for his own get-out-of-jail-free card, what he can do now. And he's implicitly acknowledged this himself by making a hollow gesture at recusal from his EO. So while this case continues, we are calling on Eric Adams to recuse himself in battles, in particular around sanctuary city status. The new EO makes clear they are coming for the funding our budget depends on. We need someone independent to stand up for our budget. I'm also reiterating our call in the executive budget for the mayor to set aside $2 billion for Trump-proofing, $1 billion increase in the general reserves against likely cuts from the federal government, and $1 billion in the rainy day fund, which we have in excess tax revenues. I think we'll see this when OMB presents its executive budget. The city's tax revenues have come in by more than $1 billion over plan. That money should be put in the rainy day fund so that if we have an economic downturn, as unfortunately seems more likely, there will be resources to defend ourselves in the coming year. At the same time, there are a set of steps that the mayor could take, that OMB could take in the executive budget that would directly protect New Yorkers from the damage the president is inflicting. And I'll just go through a few here. I stood recently with workers from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau who were laid off for the second time, basically 90% of the staff of the CFPB, who defend Americans, including New Yorkers, from predatory lending, from illegal fees, from a whole set of rapacious corporate policies, not just individuals, but small businesses as well. Unfortunately, with 90% of the CFPB essentially furloughed at this point in time, there's a real need. Luckily, New York City is one of the few cities that has a strong Department of Consumer and Worker Protection that could pick up much of the defense of consumers and small businesses. That should be reflected in New York City's budget so that consumers and small businesses know they will still be protected from predatory fees, from predatory lending, from unfair pricing that affects, again, seniors, students, independent grocers, independent pharmacies, and many others. As we included in our preliminary budget testimony, I'm calling on the mayor to include $10 million to restore funding for the Rapid Response Legal Collaborative. Things have shifted so quickly. The city had stood up an asylum seeker application help center, but at this point, where folks are going to go is much more likely to be grassroots organizations and independent legal service organizations if they're going to be able to count on the advice they get with whether they should push forward with a particular application for status, with getting work authorization, with advice on their cases. And there's a great coalition through Action NYC, which provides that support in schools, hospital, and libraries, and the Rapid Response Legal Collaborative, which gets those resources out to the organizations that speak the languages that people need, that are independent of government, that people will trust at this very untrustworthy moment. Recent federal contract terminations mean that a majority of unaccompanied children in NYC are likely, God forbid, to face deportation without an attorney. Again, this has happened now at least 3 times across the country in just the last week, where young people who are either unaccompanied minors or are citizens, but who's at least one of whom's parents are not, and when they lack legal representation, there's no one to speak up for them in a moment where due process is being left on the cutting room floor. So we're calling on the administration to add funding to iCare, $5.4 million in emergency funding from New York City to stabilize legal services for immigrant youth, and $6.3 million through the Unaccompanied Minors and Families Initiative to provide that critical representation. And finally, we are calling for the administration to create a new authority alongside H&H, funded with city, hopefully with state, and with private dollars, to provide reproductive health, abortion, contraception, and gender-affirming care before that becomes a reason that the Trump administration looks to make broader cuts to H&H. H&H provides those services now: contraception, abortion care, reproductive care, and gender-affirming care. No federal funds are utilized in any of those things, but they are done through H&H. And just as we're seeing in sanctuary cities, there's every reason to fear that those things could be essentially weaponized against the city. So before it gets to that, let's take the city money, state money and private money that's already paying for this work, move it into a new independent authority that sits alongside H&H. You can still have similar providers doing the work, but we could then make sure that we keep the about $1 billion that the federal government is providing to H&H, while we also maintain the reproductive health care and gender-affirming care that New Yorkers rely on. Let's see that in the budget. So those are all the budget items. I'll shift now to a little bit on congestion pricing. As folks read last week, the Trump administration accidentally posted a memo that confirmed what legal experts have long suspected. And even the federal lawyers working on the case know to be true. The Trump administration's legal case against the MTA is weak and will likely fail in court. Congestion pricing has prevailed multiple times. It stands on firm legal ground. It was duly passed at the state level, and then the city, the state, and the federal government appropriately granted the approvals that are and were required, and multiple judges have affirmed that the MTA did its due diligence and that the federal government appropriately approved the environmental assessment. So there's no legal grounds for cancellation. That's what we knew when we convened a coalition of legal experts last summer to ensure that congestion pricing actually went into effect rather than remain on pause. And that is why Trump's own lawyers issued a memo saying, there's no case here, what are we even doing? What we know is that both the law and the facts are on our side. We knew the law was on our side, but new stats make it clear this week that the facts are on our side even more than we knew, and we've listed just a few of them here. We're seeing 80,000 fewer vehicles every day entering the Central Business District. That's a 12% reduction in traffic, 10 to 30% faster travel times at the bridges and tunnels, a 13% decrease in traffic crashes over time. That'll mean a 13% decrease in traffic crash deaths and injuries. Meanwhile, nearly 9% increase in subway ridership, nearly a 12% increase in city bike usage. Congestion pricing is working. And meanwhile, in its first quarter, raised $159 million that the MTA can invest in modern signal systems, in subway elevators, in platform barriers, in new station gates to make our subways faster, cleaner, more accessible, and safer. That $15 billion is critical if we're going to have the subway system that New Yorkers deserve. Congestion pricing is working. It's solidly grounded in the law and on the facts. And despite the Trump and Duffy's efforts, we are going to keep pushing forward. Now, they're still attempting to kill it, and most recently, their new threat is to pull other federal funding from the MTA and the Department of Transportation if the cameras don't get turned off. But let's be clear, just like their bogus attempts to kill congestion pricing, pulling those funds would be illegal. These are dollars that have been authorized by Congress under programs like the IIJA, and USDOT is legally obligated to distribute those funds. So I am glad to see that the governor and the MTA have been clear that the cameras are staying on, that they will go into court to defend the program, and that they'll go into court as necessary to defend New York's transit funding against a capricious authoritarian president. We are going to stand up and fight for the programs that are working, and it is so much better to do it with the law and the facts on our side. Finally, I want to talk a little about the risks that our nonprofits are facing and what the city should be doing about this. With the recent attacks on universities and nonprofits, it is clear that the Trump administration is going to use every tool they can to silence dissent and threaten civil institutions. We obviously saw, the battle that they're having with Harvard, and it was great that Harvard stood up, but they've made clear they're going to go far beyond universities and look to threaten the 501c3 charitable status of nonprofits, come with investigations, cut funding, and seek to repress these institutions. We've seen 2 institutions threatened already in New York City. DOJ and congressional Republicans are seeking to weaponize federal funding to target the Vera Institute, which saw its federal funding cut, and then we're told that DOJ was going to embed people there. Props to Vera for standing up and saying there is no authority there. I have to evoke, when I talk about Vera, Herb Sturz, who is a beloved mentor of mine and the founder of the Vera Institute. He was an Ed Koch deputy mayor, first person to call for the closure of Rikers, continued working till he was 90, and he is rolling in his grave, but proud that the Vera Institute, which he created, is standing up and fighting. And similarly, their DHS and Congress are targeting the Chinese American Planning Council, trying to make an example of them, just for doing the kind of work I mentioned before of providing guidance and representation and advice to immigrants. The Trump administration intends to make people fear that if they do what they're contracted for by the city or what donors expect, they risk losing their nonprofit status or facing federal investigation, even criminal investigation. So last week I applauded New York State Attorney General Tish James's efforts to support nonprofits as they're navigating these cuts, as they're navigating these threats. The city can and must do more. The Mayor's Office of Nonprofit Services should be following the Attorney General's example and letting those nonprofits that are funded by New York City know how to weather the attacks they're getting. In many cases, this is money that is federal money, but coming through New York City to these nonprofits. Over $4 billion flows to New York City's human service nonprofits, federal money through the city two critical nonprofit human service providers. We detailed that funding in one of the early reports that we did that you can find on our website in this new section we've set up about protecting New Yorkers. But the Mayor's Office of Nonprofit Services should be picking up the ball and letting people know which programs are under threat, what they should be doing if they get a subpoena, what they should be doing if their funding is frozen, comparing notes between different nonprofits so that if they've got similar programs, are they getting similar notices and the like. And then at the same time, we should at least be making sure that the city itself is not making the lives and the jobs of our human service nonprofits even harder. But unfortunately, that is what the Adams administration has been doing, is making it more difficult for our city's nonprofits just to get paid for the invoices that they've been submitting. I'm pleased that the council's having a hearing tomorrow, that new legislation is being introduced. And I saw that the administration announced today an intention to start a advances program, although with very little detail to know who would get that money advanced. We are releasing today a new report that looks at payment delays. And one critical thing here to note, the Comptroller's Office for years, including under my administration and the prior one, looked at late contract registration. So that's when an agency takes 10 months or a year just to get a contract to us before we can register it. But in recent months during the Adams administration, over the last year or two, a new problem has emerged, which is even after you get your contract registered, when you submit your invoices, they don't pay them. And that was not happening before, and we decided to dig in and take a look at that situation. And what we found is up here. We found nearly 7,000 pending unpaid invoices. So those are on contracts that were already registered. You can't submit an invoice until your contract is registered. Already registered contracts that our office has registered, 7,000 unpaid invoices for over $1 billion, most of it for work that was completed prior to June 30th, 2024. So again, these are contracts that for the most part began July 1st, 2023 or earlier, that got registered by our office prior to last June 30th, where nonprofit organizations then did the work last year, sometime generally between July 1st of 2023 and June 30th of 2024, submitted their invoices and still have not been paid. So 7,000 pending invoices for over $1 billion. And those payment delays have worsened. We found they're 16% worse in 2024 than they were in 2019. In other words, the Adams administration here is doing 16% worse just at paying invoices. Again, these are already approved contracts. Meanwhile, there's $4.5 billion in late unregistered contracts. And this is just such an area where good management and deadlines are what make the difference. Our office is required under the city charter to register contracts when we receive them within 30 days. Under my administration, we've beat that by 37%. Our average is just 17 days. We've done over 60,000 contracts, and every single one has been either registered, 99% of the time registered, or if there's a problem, returned to the agency with the problem noted in those 30 days with an average of 17. And yet the Adams administration is now at 7,000 late invoices over $1 billion, at $4.5 billion in late contracts. Most human service agencies wait over 200 days to get their first payment from when they started providing those services, and we're seeing this get worse under this administration. What is in the legislation that the council is considering tomorrow and what the Adams administration is announcing today, but with very few details, are advance payments. So rather than figuring out how to get people paid on time, they're saying, we don't know, we're just gonna go ahead and give you some money at the start of the contract. And look, nonprofits who are desperate for money and terrified of what's happening in the federal government, they need help. So this is a Band-Aid that may help some of our nonprofits make their payrolls, avoid defaulting on loans, avoid going out of business. This is like what we did when I became controller and pushed the mayor to do the Clear the Backlog initiative that freed up about $4 billion for nonprofits. Now, that was money they had already spent, and we were just paying them. Part of my job as controller is to reduce corruption risks. One thing that is risky is paying people for work they haven't done yet. And that is what the Adams administration is doing here, is saying we are so incompetent, we have so utterly failed to pay people for work they've already done, that now we're just going to start throwing money out there for work that hasn't been done yet, because we've got to get you some funding for advances. And look, helping people not go out of business makes sense, but you know what makes more sense? Having clear deadlines, having real management systems, being transparent about where the contracts are and where the invoices are, and getting city agencies to pay their vendors on time. We've shown here in the controller's office you can do it when you've got a deadline, when you've got management attention. You could do it 60,000 times and get people paid. So as we are facing these assaults from the Trump administration on our nonprofits, let's get people paid, and not in a way that puts New Yorkers' money at risk. Those are the three risks we're looking at this week: the Sanctuary City executive order, the assault on congestion pricing, and the attacks on New York City's nonprofits. We're going to keep doing these weekly where there's a theme, like last week when it was Earth Day, or the week before that when we had new economic numbers to release. We'll focus. Where there's not, we'll take the threats of the week, break them down into what they mean for New Yorkers, and what New York City and New York State can do to step up and protect New Yorkers in these volatile times. So thank you very much for attending, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Any questions? Jack.
So you laid out a lot of threats to New York City. The mayor is calling this the best budget ever.
The state, he's calling the state budget the best budget ever, or his own budget that he hasn't yet presented?
Exactly. He's previewing the executive budget as the best budget ever. So obviously we haven't seen it, but is he too optimistic here? What do you think of that branding?
I mean, the mayor has misrepresented many, many things, and it won't be surprising if his executive budget is one of them. Can't really comment on it until we see it. We've put some benchmarks out there. If they put the money in the rainy day fund and create the general reserve, as we've called for, I'll give them credit for doing it. If he fully funds 3K, as he announced last week or the week before that he intended to do, as we have been calling for years at this point, we'll give him credit for doing that as well. But at this moment in time, given what Washington is doing, given what the risks are to the economy, given what the risks are to those 7,700 families who could be facing homelessness, given the risks that we could have our federal funding cut as part of this Sanctuary City work, it takes a pretty myopic, narrow, and corrupted point of view to say anything is particularly great at this moment in time.
Great. Any other questions?
More on the electoral front.
Yep.
Trump is already targeting New York City under a mayor that he has a lot of alignment with. Are you concerned that how Trump would target New York City if you, a bleeding heart liberal, he would probably call you a communist, is elected? I mean, do you think he would be putting a target on New York City if elected?
Look, Trump has put a target on New York City, and he's doing it more and more. That's why we're holding these briefings, is to try to break down those threats. The Sanctuary City executive order doesn't only target New York City, but it certainly targets New York City. Congestion pricing and their war on congestion pricing only targets New York City, and they've picked some New York City nonprofits for targeting, and they have ratcheted up deportation enforcement here as well. What's critical to do, in my opinion, is have a mayor who stands up to protect New Yorkers using the law as a critical defense, and that's what Eric Adams is utterly failing to do. Again, he wouldn't even have gone into court to get the $80 million back. I think he would have just said, oh, I guess the price of my pardon is $80 million. That's not going to help us. There's no route down which that kind of capitulation leads to better outcomes. It just means more and more capitulation. I think, Americans have seen that when Harvard stood up, then the administration had to say, oh, oops, we sent the letter without meaning to. And congestion pricing, what a good example there. I'm sure if it was up to Eric Adams, we would have caved on congestion pricing. Instead, you stand up. And in that case, even their own lawyers have to admit that they're on weak legal ground. So, look, the city relies on substantial federal programs. And of course, you work with the agencies. You comply with all the rules. On the $80 million, we have a contract. We did the invoice that came out for a site visit. It was Trump administration officials who signed off on the invoice. So work with the federal government under the rule of law based on those contracts and funding. Absolutely. Of course, we'll do that in the Landrieu administration. But it is critical to stand up and defend yourself, and I think that will be a better way of making sure that we can protect New Yorkers. That's what they did with that litigation in San Francisco. That's what Tish James is doing at the state level. New York should be part of the network of cities that are standing up together. That has a lot. And sometimes you can even do that with red cities and red states, let's remember. They're going to come for programs that everyone relies on. I'm focused on the 7,700 New York City families that would be homeless if those emergency housing vouchers are lost. But that went everywhere. And
So you don't think he would go harder on New York City, target more funding if a progressive were elected?
I mean, look, I think he is going to keep wreaking havoc in all kinds of ways. I think New York City will be best served by someone who is stepping up to aggressively protect New York City, using legal recourse in every situation where we have it, and being smarter about use of the budget. This is where putting reserves aside is planning. Adams' administration hasn't done it. Jacques, the budget director, I guess, said, we don't want to put reserves aside because then we think they'll target us. But they're already targeting us. The reserves help you respond and prevent those families from becoming homeless. The authority I'm proposing, I don't think that's going to be to New York City. I think when they come, if they come and say, look, if you're a public health authority anywhere in the country, that even if you're not using federal funds, the entity that's getting federal funds is also providing abortions, we're going to cut your funds. That just seems like a thing they might plausibly do. That's not about New York City, but it affects New York City. If we were getting ready, we'd have a better chance of defending ourselves. So yes, I believe, that a mayor that's committed to protecting New Yorkers, using the law, using thoughtful planning, using strategic governance will be much more effective at protecting New Yorkers. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week, if not before.